Welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the History and Public Policy program here at the center, and it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this event entitled From Historian to Incidental Diplomat, the writing of history before and after participating in its making, with former Deputy Foreign Minister and negotiator and historian Gerard Libaridian. Did I pronounce that correctly? We're delighted to have him here today for this talk, an eminent authority in Armenian studies and director, in fact, of the Armenian Studies program and the Alex Manoogian Chair in Modern Armenian History at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. He formerly held the position of advisor to the President of Armenia from 1991 to September 1997. During that period, he served as senior advisor for foreign policy and security issues, as the first Deputy Foreign Minister of Foreign Affairs, as negotiator for the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, and coordinator of the conflict-related policy in the office of the President. He has taught at a number of universities, has lectured and published extensively. I won't name all of his publications. It's a long and distinguished list, but let me just name a couple of his major books. Modern Armenia, People, Nation, State, Dilemmas and Dangers of Foreign Policy in the Caucasus, the Organization, Institutions, and Centers in Armenian Studies, and The Challenge of Statehood, Armenian Political Thinking Since Independence. And I guess I should also mention Armenia at Crossroads, Democracy and Nationhood in the Post-Soviet Era. So our guest speaker is eminently qualified to talk about a subject that cuts to the very core of what we try to do here at the center, and that is really to create a dialogue between the policymakers and the scholars, and to get both communities, the scholarly and the world of ideas and the world of policy, the policy community, to talk to each other. In fact, you bring both perspectives to the table, and so we're very thrilled to have you here today, privileged and honored that you will talk to us. Before I give you the floor, let me first of all ask you to turn off your cell phones. And secondly, since we have our guest was interested, I'd like to go around the table and ask everybody just quickly introduce themselves with their name and whatever else they'd like to say. But no long monologues, just a brief introduction, so our guest knows who he's talking to. So we'll start right here.
My name is Asma Kavikuya, and I have been with the system in Armenia.
So she's here to double check, so I don't tell you any lies, right?
Excellent. Okay. Do we have a microphone we can pass? I think that would help with the webcast and capturing all of you. All right. So.
Again, Patrick Garabedian, Federal Government at IOE.
William Eads, we're here from LSUS Shreveport.
Heath Kelly from LSUS Shreveport.
Alexa Langer from LSU Shreveport.
Melissa Whittington from LSU Shreveport.
Michelle Caldwell from LSU Shreveport.
William Eads, LSU Shreveport.
Bill Peterson. I teach political science at LSU Shreveport, and we're honored that you haven't kicked us out and allowed us to come in here.
Well, we're delighted.
Aaron Wilson, LSU Shreveport.
I'm Bernadette Palumbo. I'm a professor and chair of the Department of History and Social Sciences at LSU Shreveport.
I'm Sarah Harble at LSUS Shreveport.
I'm Felisa Stokes, LSU Shreveport, criminal justice major.
Ashley Bankston, LSUS Shreveport.
Ana Martinez, LSU Shreveport, and I'm originally from Mexico. Stephen Shore, I'm with the federal government.
John Evans, I served for a time as U.S. Ambassador to Armenia.
Katie Pierce, former student and research assistant of Dr. Liberian, and I now do polling for the U.S. Department of State in the Caucasus.
Excellent. Well, thank you so.
Make more sense if they were all from Georgia rather than Louisiana.
That's right. Well, that's your audience. Welcome again, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Osterman. It's a pleasure being here. But before I start, may I ask if the students, the group, has any idea of things Armenia, Georgia? Can I assume anything? Or are we starting from scratch and you are as accidentally here as I was a diplomat? I mean, the latter? Okay.
I had my last professor for history was in Georgia, so and I looked up some stuff about Georgia, but I don't know much else.
Well, they've got a nicer capital. Don't say that to Armenians; they'll kill me. Okay. What I'm going to try and do today is a first attempt at reconciling my two different careers and how each has affected the other. It's a topic that has been coming to my mind. I've been taking some notes here and there. That is what happens when you move from writing to participating in the making of history. How different may you be functioning and thinking if you were a historian before, and then you leave all of that and then go back to the writing and teaching of history, and what changes. And this is this takes me to the core of the art. I can't say anymore the science, but the art of writing history. And what does it mean? I should say that after I wrote some notes, I decided that the title of the talk is wrong, that I was an accidental diplomat. I don't think I was incidental. Now, so I'm going to go back and forth in the different periods to raise some important issues. Part of what I'm going to talk about will look like an intellectual biography, but I think it will be much more than that. It will cover basic policies related to Armenian history and politics in the last 100 years, and certainly with direct reference implications for today's issues. And there will be 2 points that I think will emerge at the end. One is, oddly enough, the centrality of Turkey in the making and definition of Armenia today and in the past century. It is central. And the second thing is that on the Armenian side, we see certain patterns of behavior, political, that repeat themselves. So these are the 2 main points that will come up. I started writing a dissertation, obviously when I was much younger, for my PhD at UCLA, initially on the Armenian political parties that were founded beginning in 1888. And then when I was trying to characterize them and place them in the context of the wider Armenian history, I realized that I can't do it without going to the earlier period and looking at Armenian political thinking before. And I ended up writing a dissertation after having done all the research for one topic and writing half the dissertation. To the dismay of my professor, I went back and started all over and did 16th through the 19th century ideology of Armenian liberation. And I was interested in a few issues that were obviously interrelated. One is what internal developments within the Armenian stateless communities or people were relevant to the development of ideas of liberation of Armenia. How did Armenians ended up developing a strategy that that relied heavily on the intervention of the great powers of the time, that is bringing in third party when they were trying to get reforms done as part of the Ottoman Empire. And to what extent did they have any kind of autonomy to make decisions on their own? How did this community function? How did it relate to the larger community, the Ottoman state, of which most Armenians were part, and the European, mainly Great Britain, France, Germany, Russia. Germany came in a little later, but France, Great Britain, and Russia mainly. I was very, I would say, burdened by the fact that a lot of Armenian history was written with having Armenians as victims of massacres, of genocide, and I thought that kind of history makes Armenians totally objects of history, but not subjects. That is, they're not doing anything. Things are happening to them. And the question is, did it matter for a small people, nation like Armenians, as to what they said and did in terms of what happened to them? Do they have any sense of responsibility? And that was the subject of my dissertation, which has come back to haunt me, and I think within a year I'll be publishing it after some changes in the first 2 chapters, because it is more relevant now than it was then. And certainly in view of my experience. Now, to get into this subject, let me mention the reason why I was asking about the Wilson Center is that I have been to the Wilson Center once before. And it was an interesting event. In 1979, President Carter, Zbigniew Brzezinski as security advisor, and he, in my memory, is the only one who convened a conference on the Caucasus, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan. No one else had bothered with that before, and I don't think anyone did after that until the collapse of the Soviet Union. And at that time, I spoke of Armenia and Soviet Armenia, and at that time, assistant to Brzezinski, Paul Henze, asked me a question. He said, well, you know, the Soviets are encouraging Armenians to be anti-Turkish. Aren't they concerned that someday that anti-ness can move from anti-Turkish to anti-Soviet? And my response was, well, I was thinking, being anti-Turkish, I thought was quite natural. Generationally, I belonged to those who in the 60s found that the genocide needed to be politicized, that it was not just a matter of human disaster, but it was a major historical event in the Armenian case, and the genocide had ended the existence of the Armenian people on most of their historic homeland. And that is much bigger, and the losses. So we were the generation that politicized that genocide. And I was one of the first, in fact, I was one of 3 who organized the first demonstrations against the Turkish General Council in Los Angeles in 1970. So my answer obviously was that, excuse me, Mr. Henze, but no one needs to tell me that Turkey is a problem for Armenians. This is what happened, and it's natural that we will demonstrate against Turkey and ask that the genocide be recognized and maybe reparations and whatever. Until then, the Armenians in the world had been divided. The major agenda on their agenda item was those who supported Soviet Armenia, saying that's the last piece of Armenia we need to protect and defend, even if it is Soviet and communist, and those who opposed it. This was the main issue. It is in the 60s and the 70s that we see a shift among those, particularly one political party, the Tashnag, or Armenian Revolutionary Federation, that drops its anti-Soviet campaign and moves toward the anti-Turkish campaign. So for the first time, we see a consensus among Armenians in Soviet Armenia, outside in the diaspora, where everyone thinks that the main issue facing Armenians is the legacy of the genocide, political, territorial, and human, and every other way. Now, this was a natural development, but also later on we find that, in fact, a lot of it was not so natural. There were other factors that moved Armenians to be anti-Turkish, to move to the anti-Turkish set of activities and accepting Soviet Armenia as it was. Now, going back to the discussion of my dissertation and what happened after what my dissertation covered, I realized that there were the model of history that we had created was not accurate. That is, the Armenian question, what the Ottoman governments did to Armenians in the 1890s massacres, in 1915-17 a genocide, that all of that cannot be understood if we look at it as an Armenian versus Turkish issue. That unless we understand that the situation can best be explained by looking at a triangle. The great powers of Europe, the Ottoman government, and the Armenians, each having two opposing faces. The great powers were the source of enlightenment and democracy and what we call today human rights, protection of Christians in the Ottoman Empire, all the great things from Jean-Jacques Rousseau to the French Revolution to the idea of republicanism, citizenship, etc., all the good things. On the other hand, they were the imperialist powers. They were subjugating continents, not just other nations and countries. So one is the bright side and one is the nasty side. The Ottoman government, on the one hand, was a medieval-style state that could hardly reform itself fundamentally except in some technical areas. The Ottoman government was an oppressor state of many smaller nations, including Armenians. But at the same time, it was the victim of great power imperialism. And the Armenians, who were the oppressed, the massacred, on the one hand, so the victim, on the other hand, they had aligned their interest with those of the great powers, hoping that the great powers would press the Ottomans to implement reforms in the Armenian areas. So Armenians, too, had two sides. And unless one understood this triangle, one would not be able to understand fully what happened and why. That is, to some extent, Armenians were alienated from their own environment, natural environment, from the Turks and Muslims and Kurds living with them, and identified more closely, both culturally, of course, certainly religious-wise, but also in their strategy with the great powers, the imperial powers. And the rising Turkish nationalism, not just the Ottoman state's own sense of survival, made it very difficult for them to really accept external pressures. And it had become obvious that in order for that history to be written, we really need to also understand the internal domestic Turkish processes. This analysis at the time had made me very wary of international intervention. But I wasn't sure as to what I would do with it. But when I started working in Armenia and international mediation became the main way to resolve the conflicts, my tendency as a historian who was unhappy with the previous pattern was to go to direct and secret negotiations. That was the first thing that was different. With Turkey and with Azerbaijan, even if not secret, but direct negotiations. Take responsibility for what you want, and I didn't think that negotiating with Turkish diplomats or Azerbaijani diplomats, that there were any people who understood better what was needed by Armenia and by Azerbaijan. Why can't we sit down and talk? Are we less intelligent? Are we less discerning in our? We could do it. And by cutting out the mediator, that was the first thing that occurred to me. And I ended up being part of at least three major, I would say, direct negotiations. One was with Turkey for the establishment of the protocol for establishment of normal diplomatic relations. I'll discuss it in a little while. That did not produce any results. The second was negotiations directly with Azerbaijan to make the ceasefire on the Karabakh conflict permanent, and that was successful. And the third was the negotiating with my Azerbaijani colleague on a fundamental solution to the Karabakh conflict with Azerbaijan, and we came very, very close to doing that. Closer than anyone thinks, including on the issue of the status of Karabakh. Now, so for me, this was a major thing that came from my being a historian, that if you can go and establish trust and go after what you need, not what you want. You may want the sky, but what is it that you need? Recognize the other's needs and then work accordingly. And secondly, I found that although I had no diplomatic experience, I had read so much history and documents that I had become extremely discerning in terms of words. How do you use words to overcome differences? And including the creative ambiguities and uncertainties in a document. If both of us need something, but politically it becomes difficult, then we can settle on an ambiguous statement which each of us could interpret. And this came from being a historian. Now, what happens now in the 80s, going back, is that this consensus that had been created between the segments of the Armenian diaspora communities, as well as between the diaspora and Soviet Armenia, the primacy of the genocide recognition campaign. This was after 7, 8 decades after the genocide that there was conflict within the community. So this happens, and then what happens is what Paul Henze had mentioned. That is, Armenians in Armenia turn against the Soviet Union. They didn't ask us, the diaspora and Armenians. They disrupted our vacation. They disrupted our happy consensus. And the conflict started on the Karabakh territorial issue with Azerbaijan, but very soon it turned into a movement for independence and democracy. And this disrupted the diaspora. And there are a lot of people, most organizations, I would say all organizations, were against Armenia becoming independent. They will not want to remember this today, and this is one of the problems of writing history, because as soon as something happens, we may want to forget it. And forgetting, of course, is part of history, but on the other hand, the function of history is not to forget. So organizations were against Armenia's independence. Why? Because they did not believe, they had come to believe that Armenia could not be independent, because as soon as it became independent, Turkey would come and commit genocide against the surviving Armenians and wipe out Armenia. Now you see the connection between genocide as a historical event and genocide as a political argument against independence. That is, the fact that Turkey refuses to recognize the genocide means that Turkey is a genocidal state, genocidist states, and by the way, Turks are evil anyway, right? They're bad people. Turks are born to kill, Armenians are born to be killed, and Turkey will always be a threat to Armenians. So as soon as we become independent, Turkey, which is much bigger, much more powerful, will come and take care of the rest of us. This was a very serious argument, and this became the subject, had become already, before my going to Armenia, the subject of my Armenia at the Crossroads, where I presented all the arguments that were coming in favor and against. And the question I posed there was, can Armenia be independent? So, which is that Turkey? Is Turkey what these guys are saying, that no matter what happens, they're going to kill the rest of us? Or is what happened a historical event tied to the specific events and people and problems of the time, so that Turkey may have changed, will have changed, and does it matter what we say to Turkey today in terms of what they will say or do to us? So this ties into the issues of my dissertation. This is why I'm going into these. So in my mind, by the 80s, I had come to conclude that the strictly anti-Turkish campaign that essentializes the Turks was may have been useful at some point, but was a waste of time. And it was not a strategy that would function. And it was necessary to talk to the Turks and see if they will own up to their history. And this was my conclusion in the 80s. And at the same time as a bunch of guys in Armenia had reached the conclusion that 1915 was a historical event, that the recognition of the genocide is not the most important thing in the world, that such an interpretation of making the genocide the dominant element will stop you from asking for independence or fighting for independence and democracy, which was much more important. And all of this distorts whatever we have as history. And besides, once the movement started in Armenia and in Azerbaijan, there were anti-Armenian pogroms. The argument was clear. Being part of the Soviet Union has not saved Armenians from being massacred. And the movement in Armenia moved toward independence and democracy. Now, I went to Armenia in January 1991. At the time, still the Soviet Union, and Levon Ter-Bedrosyan, who had been elected, one of the leaders of the movement, he'd been elected to the presidency of the parliament. There was no executive presidency at the time, and he asked me to go to Armenia for 3 months. And because I was director of an institute in Cambridge, Mass., he said, can you come and we have a new democratic parliament, could you come for 3 months and establish a research unit, because a democratic parliament without a research unit doesn't make sense. So I said, well, 3 months, I don't know whether that's feasible to do, but 6 months I could if I get permission from my wife, but certainly my daughter, who was 12, and she ran the household. So, and then they said yes, and my daughter said, are you sure it was for 6 months you're going? And so I started working in January 91, and then I went to the Library of Congress to see how the Congressional Research Service functions, to the French system, the British system, and established a unit, which became a research unit for the presidency, in fact, more than the parliament. And then I thought I was done, and I should say Hasmik was the first to help me out there as chief executive assistant, because I didn't have difficulty with the language, but I had difficulty understanding what people were saying, and they had difficulty understanding what I was saying. For example, hiring someone, right? I'd ask, what music do you like? What books do you read? And that would get them to clam up. And I had Hasmik sit in the back and say, what am I doing wrong? Well, she said, what you're doing wrong is, what you're doing, you think, is understanding the person. What they think you're doing is finding an excuse not to hire them, that you've made a decision. So, it's a very different kind of problem. Anyway, the 6 months were up. I was ready to return to Cambridge. The president walks into the department, says, where are you going? We're going to declare independence. We're going to create an executive presidency. You can stay a few more months. And that became 7 years. At the end of the year, he appointed me, without asking me, advisor. And then later I became also First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and then got back and became senior advisor, secretary of the Security Council, and ambassador. I have the rank of ambassador. I don't tell everyone.
Sorry,
right?
I missed that in my introduction.
No, I
Mr. Ambassador.
hardly tell anyone. I have the rank of ambassador. I mean, there are ambassadors here. And anyway, so I ended up gradually being in charge of relations with Turkey, negotiations with Azerbaijan, and conflict-related issues with Russia and Iran, and other issues with China and Egypt, and even IMF and World Bank at different phases. So, and I'm not listing this to brag, although my wife thinks I should brag about this, but just to say that the scope of things I ended up dealing with, and how much useful it was to know, have read the newspapers for a long time and have done history. Now, in 93, I think, a former student of mine I used to teach high school in Los Angeles, she had become a reporter, came to Yerevan and did an interview with me, and she asked, how different is what you're doing from what you were doing? That is, being a diplomat. How is it different from being a professor or a researcher, right? And I thought about it and said the following. When I was a researcher or a professor, I'd wake up one morning, have coffee, and think, why did the Roman Empire collapse? And if the question came back the next day, I'd have, I asked my wife, why do you think? Over wine, right? And then you'd take 2-3 months to do some research in the library. And then you take 2-3 months to write a paper, which you present 6 months later. You say it was the lead poisoning in the piping of the senators and the elite, right? And the paper is published. 5 colleagues read it. And then you may, have reactions from them. And it makes no difference whether you're right or wrong. Now here, you're sitting the week before, 4 o'clock in the morning, the chief of staff calls me and says, the Karabakh Armenians have shut down an Iranian plane. Everyone is killed, including women and children. The Iranian ambassador is coming to see you at 6:30 in the morning. Be ready for it. And you have no way of doing research. You just check with the Karabakh Armenians what happened. You come up with a story, and I can tell you it matters what you say. Because if they don't like what you say, if you don't tell them what they want to hear, they can close the border, and Armenia's economic recovery will collapse. Because that was the only border functioning normally in terms of consumer goods and other. That's the difference. You don't have time. You can't do research. You have 2.5 hours to get up and shave and find out whatever from wherever. Now, so what you say matters. Whether you succeed or not matters with the Turks and the Azerbaijanis. And overall, though, Armenia is facing the most important problem is the war with Azerbaijan on a territory, Armenian populated, but part of Azerbaijan. And at the same time as we had come to the conclusion that we need to normalize relations with Turkey and without any preconditions. This was an extremely dangerous thing to do. That is, the country, the state that committed genocide against your people, you want to normalize. And emotionally, psychologically, it is devastating to say that the normalization of relations is a necessity for Armenia and a necessity in order to resolve the security problem as well. And that the chances for genocide recognition will be better if you have normal relations and you don't look like a threat to Turkey. This is the reverse of what had been argued. But to argue this is politically suicide outside, but not in Armenia. The people in Armenia understood this and backed this approach. Now, there were the communists and the nationalists who didn't like this. Because for them, the idea of reliance on Russia for the communists is essential for them to come back to power, because independence can disappear and the communists would come back to govern because they're the ones who are close to Russia. And for the nationalists, the whole agenda in the diaspora was based on genocide recognition, and if they don't fight for that kind of thing, then their existence is not justified. So we have strong opposition. And at the same time, this touches on the issue of mediation. That is, if we can't resolve our problems, then we have to rely on others. When others get into the problem, they have to get a piece of the pie. The Cold War had ended in general, but not in that region, and it's still not over. There's a mini Cold War continuing there, and we become again the small unit over which the others are fighting, instead of taking on our own. And the idea was to get things resolved with Azerbaijan that would lead to resolution of issues with Turkey, and with Georgia we have no serious problems. And my view was that Armenia must create options for its foreign policy. And that can be done only when you've resolved your problems and you have a regional approach to issues. And regional means at least Azerbaijan and Georgia. And this was very different from a nationalist agenda. But it also was different from the pattern that was dominant preceding the genocide, that is, the reliance on foreign powers, great powers, to solve your problems. And that's what was the main issue in my mind for Armenia's foreign policy. You have to create options. The options exist when you don't have to rely on Russia, because you have decreased the threat which Turkey represents. And, in fact, Turkey should have become part of the solution to Armenia's security problem instead of part of the problem. And this is where we were unable to get things done with Turkey. Of course, now you start negotiations with Ankara. And what Turkey do you find? Is it the Turkey that is the genocidal Turkey and whatever? Well, the Turkey was the Kemalist Turkey, very set on a securitized, army-dominated system, and all of that justified because they think that any chance the Europeans get, they'll divide up, carve up Turkey, the Sevres syndrome it is known as, and that they will, they must be vigilant. And the question of the recognition of the Armenian genocide was part of that campaign. That is, once genocide is recognized, then Armenians will want their part and the Kurds will want their part. So in the Turkish mind, too, there was this exaggerated fear, and maybe artificially exaggerated, because it justified a securitized, militarized state. We have to be vigilant, so human rights and democracy don't have to be immediately at the forefront of the political agenda. Now, I went to Ankara a few times, and every time I came back, I had two kinds of people waiting for me. One was the peasants in the villages on the border asking if the negotiations were successful. They couldn't wait till the border opened and they traded and they sold and bought. That's what they were concerned about. On the other hand, there was the second group, ambassadors from 3 countries who would be lined up to want to talk to me to see what had happened, hoping that nothing had been resolved. Now, I'll leave it up to you to decide which 3 countries were there. That they didn't want normalization. And when, at one point, I thought we were getting close in Ankara, and in fact, at some point, we were 1 sentence away from the protocol. And we were almost, we had a formula that we proposed, and the Turks, I think, were going to accept it. And I came back somewhat hopeful. And when I said to this particular ambassador, you know, this time it may have worked, that we may, in fact, have a protocol and sign an agreement, this ambassador said, but what about the genocide? The genocide is my problem, not yours, right? Your country hasn't even recognized the genocide. Why do you bring up the genocide? Right? That is, we should not normalize with Turkey because there's the issue of the genocide. And that means we will continue dependence on these countries. That means that we will not really be independent because we have no options. Now, how much time do you give me?
I'd like to have a little time for some
Right.
questions.
How much time? So,
you know, maybe another 5-10 minutes.
okay. I'll skip some of the items here, so we have time for questions. Now, the Turkey I found was, in fact, a Kemalist Turkey, but it was also, that is very clear-cut history, no deviations. The Republic of Turkey begins with the Republic of Turkey. That is, we don't go back to earlier history. Atatürk, the founder of the Republic, had made that very clear. And that history of the Republic begins basically by arguing that Turkey had a virgin birth, that it became a state without having touched anyone, but only being the victim. You see, what had happened is the Turks, when they wrote their history, they remembered the part where they were victims of European imperialism. When Armenians wrote their history, they wrote the part where they were victims of Ottoman massacres. And these two histories, at the same time, same land, centuries of coexistence, good or bad, they were totally different histories. And these histories did not communicate. And it was very difficult for the Turkish leadership, particularly in the foreign ministry, because in the 70s and early 80s, two Armenian groups organized terroristic attacks against Turkish diplomats. They killed some 30, 35 in different parts of the world and blew up some Turkish embassies and places and the airline office, etc. And these diplomats with whom I was negotiating were the colleagues and the potential victims of that terrorism. And that's what they know of things Armenian. They didn't know anything else. Soviet Armenia didn't exist for them. They dealt with Moscow. Who cared about Soviet Armenia, Azerbaijan, or Georgia? So there was total alienation of the problem. And it took quite a bit on our part to convince them that we are a state and we have a different policy. In fact, it was my book on the Armenia at the Crossroads where I presented the arguments that may have convinced at least some of them, because one of the major officers in the Foreign Office in Turkey brought back the book to me, marked. He said, these are the parts I showed the Prime Minister and the President, to show that Armenia has a different agenda than the diaspora. So, but also Turkey was the one that opened its railroads for us when the Abkhaz War stopped the rail link from Russia to Armenia. Wheat couldn't come to Armenia. So we asked the Turks, while negotiating, as a sign of goodwill, to open their railroads to bring the wheat that the European Union had donated. And it is that wheat that came through Turkey that saved Armenia from famine in the winter of 92 to 93. And this is something which I've written about, I've lectured about, but somehow no one picks it up. It is not convenient to remember that Turkish leaders forgot they were supposed to kill us. They didn't have to do anything to kill us. All they had to do is say no to the raid. How do you bring in wheat? 1,000 tons a day. You don't do it, can't do it by plane. There's no other way. The rail with Iran is not working. Rail with Georgia is not working. And the rail with Turkey was closed off. They opened it just for this. So that was the Turkey too. That helped us. So let me get to some conclusions. Since I left the government, it was, 14 years ago. When I teach now, I find that although I use the same notes that I did from 30 years ago when I used to teach Armenian history, I focus on different things than I did then. I focus on the decision-making process, not so much on the bigger things. How were decisions made? With who spoke for Armenians? With what legitimacy? And what is the difference, what is the link between decision-making on major issues and your legitimacy and the basis of your power? This has become much more important to me. I've come to realize, and I focus more on asymmetries in history. That is, when Armenia made that revolution of overcoming the genocide issue in the way that it did under Terroristic, Turkey was not ready. Later on, I think the early months of the Erdogan government in Turkey, they were ready, and Armenia was not. So there was an asymmetry. It's not enough to want something. You have to be able to sell it to your people. And each side has to be able to do that. I realize more than ever that a real homeland is very different from an imagined one. That is, diaspora Armenians imagine an Armenia. And when the border opened, independence came, and they could travel, they did not find the Armenia they imagined. They found a real country with real problems, with real people. And that issue has become much clearer. I found that the issue of history repeats itself, right? Has become totally irrelevant in my mind. And we should learn from history, right? If it repeats itself, so we learn in order not to make the same mistakes. Believe me, we'll make the same mistakes. It's not changing. The patterns have not changed. Armenia has gone back to the old pattern, waiting for the international community to bring in solutions instead of attacking the problems themselves. This is a serious problem. We're both historians. We go back to that history. The lessons Christian here draws from that same history, from the same facts, are opposite to what I draw. That is, we begin, unless we're really critical toward ourselves and our own prejudices and approaches and sensitive to these things, we begin with a certain framework, and we find in history those things and those interpretations that suit us at this moment. So history is a justification for what we do and what we want to do. When I was finishing my dissertation, my advisor was very unhappy with me. And he didn't think my interpretation was right because it was brand new on the 18th century, and he didn't like it. And so he had objections. And then I wrote a letter to him. At that time, there was no email. We used to write letters. And I wrote to him, I said, I've come to the conclusion that historians are like failed gods. They fail to create the future in their own image, so they create the past in their own image. And that means that we really, and this was very old, I tell you, and it's original. I haven't read it anywhere. So it is very obvious to me that it's not enough that we know history. It is sometimes useful that we even forget. But learning from history is a very different process than knowing it. So that has created quite a bit of doubt in my mind with regard to the writing of history today. The other point is, so much of what happened is already forgotten or distorted. So much that is forgotten of the things that happened at the time. Forgotten because there's no record. During revolutionary times, change of regime, a lot of decisions are made standing up. So many decisions were made in the president's house or my apartment. We were in the same living, or some minister's place late at night. You get together and say, there's this problem, you discuss, you have a logic, you have a decision. There's no record of the thing. And that's why we're doing an oral history project in Armenia now, recording as much as possible. So much is forgotten willingly. People will forget that they betrayed their friends. People will forget that they made a decision and went against it. People will forget they made pledges with regard to policies and didn't follow it. And people will try to make sure that history does not record certain things. So, to conclude, I have come to doubt the history I have written and to doubt the history that I'm writing now. It's a very difficult thing to say, but I've moved away from the grand design history, and I find that there's so much that I remember. I seem to have a very good memory. A lot of other people have forgotten the things I remember, and I've decided to write things that I know, that I am sure of, that others want to forget or have forgotten already. And that's my next book. It's in the works. It will be ready maybe in 3-4 months, and it will be very different. I hate to call it history. I'm calling it a narrative. I've become very modest in my old age. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for this very thoughtful, candid, self-critical remarks. The floor is open we have just a few minutes for some questions. I would especially encourage the younger generation here to ask questions, but of course everybody is welcome to give questions or comments. And if you can wait for the microphone, and again, state your name for the record. So, go ahead.
My name is Felicia Stokes. I'm with LSU Shreveport. My question is, do you have a website with a list of all the books you've published? And in those books, does it include all the negotiations you've been involved in? Or is that something is it private information? Or
well, I don't have a website. Okay. I'm still behind the times. Okay. But if you go to Google, you'll see my books to begin with. And my negotiations with Turkey have been summarized in my last big book, Modern Armenia, and I think it's chapter 12. So, because everyone was talking about these negotiations, despite the fact that the genocide issue did not come up in these negotiations, except the first time my Turkish colleague, was surprised, and he brought it up. But other than that, it hasn't come up. But almost everyone who writes on it is sure that the reason why it failed was because Turkey did not recognize the genocide. That was not the truth. So I wrote a chapter on that to say this is the different phases. So that is there. But the other negotiations with Azerbaijan, no, but there's one part of it, one of the secret negotiations with my colleague Vafa Gulizadeh, not the contents, but the form, has become a master's thesis by a student at the University of Chicago. He's just finishing it. He came twice to interview me, to see how did this go, because it's not written about at all. Some people know it happened, but it is not written about. But I told him the whole process, not the contents. Because the contents I'm not sure I will publish, because at the end that's going to be the solution to the problem.
Okay. The lady in the corner, and then we'll go to...
Professor Labaridian, I'm assuming that your dissertation was completed before you were the senior advisor for foreign policy.
Yes.
So my question to you is, had you finished your dissertation after you played that role in Armenia, do you think your dissertation would have been different? Yes. Because you would have had a very different perspective from that of a diplomat rather than from the inside, rather than a historian from the outside.
Absolutely.
And how would it have been different, do you think?
Well, I tell you, when I mean, that dissertation loomed large in my mind after I started working in Armenia. And 4 summers ago, I set aside a month and redid the first chapter because I thought it was too dense. It had to be opened up. But once I started rewriting it, it came out very, very different.
So that was your nature of your next book then?
Well, no, the next book is on the Karabakh conflict, and that's also about 50–60% done. And I'm hoping that this month I'll be able to have 2 months to finish, and then I'll go to that dissertation and redo the second chapter as well. The rest is pretty good. So, and that I'm changing the title from The Ideology of Armenian Liberation to In Search of the Savior.
Very good. Yes, Ambassador, and then we'll microphone.
I can understand how difficult it is for all of you to get all the references here and understand all the conflicts and the. I wish we had a map. I just want to say a couple things. I used to work in the State Department, and I ended up being assigned as ambassador to Armenia, and I got myself into a situation which very much reflected the conflict between someone who thinks of themselves as a scholar, although I never would pretend to be a real historian, and someone who is serving his government. And I, in the end, was removed from my office because my fidelity to the historical truth of the fact that the Armenian people were massacred in a form of genocide in 1915. That was not U.S. policy, but it came up in an academic discussion that I was addressing at UCLA. And I said, yes, I believe it was a genocide. And because of that, I was removed from my position as U.S. ambassador. This is also all on the record. My dad started his teaching career in Louisiana, and I just want to say welcome to you all. The Wilson Center is, as you are seeing today, is a place that brings together the scholarly world and the world of policy. And at times, this intersection is very uncomfortable because some things are off the record. I mean, think about WikiLeaks. Now, you all as students are living in a time that scholars before you could only envy. Now, I'm not going to suggest that everybody go and read what are still considered to be classified cables and telegrams of the U.S. government, but I've done it myself, and there is incredible information out there today that wasn't available to other generations. And so, if I may put this in the form of a question to you, Professor, this difficult intersection between the worlds of policy and the worlds of scholarship, is it going to be changed, do you think, by modern conditions in which so much more information is almost inevitably going to be put out there? There are going to be fewer chances to forget, fewer chances to mislead. It's all going to be hanging out there. Is that your perception?
No.
No? Okay.
I don't think the availability of information is going to change the decision-making process. And that's what matters. That is, when the leaders of the movement in Armenia, who knew history and learned what I thought should have been learned and what I had learned, and they came to power and implemented a policy, people followed. But now they're changed, there's another team, and they don't have the same kind of commitment to learning from history. In fact, the second president of Armenia was very proud of the fact that he had never read a book. No, that's true. That's true, and he said it. And some of those too, you know. Yeah, no, but he said, you know, I don't want to read books, particularly books on history, because it will limit my freedom to act as my stomach tells me I should act. He said, I act from my gut, and you know, and if I know history, it's going to be a problem for me. for that one, yeah.
Okay, final question.
Ambassador, could you go into more detail on how the Armenian diaspora in the United States complicated your role in serving as a diplomat?
Oh, that's, yeah, I can write a whole book on that one. But let me be brief, but say that, yes, there was a segment of the community that opposed that administration, opposed that president, opposed our policies with regard to Turkey, and campaigned and used its lobbying links, and they're powerful, they even tried to stop American aid, bilateral aid to Armenia. They were sending faxes. I received one at my home. I mean, my wife was in Cambridge. We still have the house. And faxes would come there. My wife would say, you know that this is what they're doing. And there's something, what I call intellectual terrorism. And you end up having difficulty, although we had no difficulty dealing with the American diplomats or the government itself, the executive. But Congress is somewhat different. It's more influenced. And it becomes very difficult because they not only disagree, but, you know, if they decide to campaign against you, then it becomes very difficult. I remember that I was giving a lecture at Columbia University, and I mentioned that Armenia is the Armenia of today. The government of Armenia is responsible for the 29,500 kilometer squares that Armenia is today, nothing more, and responsible only for the people who are in Armenia. That's bad enough. That's difficult enough, right? And I said that, and I was served a summons. There was a federal case opened against me in New York as a leader of another government. I mean, I had to spend $30,000 to get lawyers to a case that wasn't even heard, right? But only to bug you, just to... Now, let me finish with one thing, right? You don't want more questions, right? What I remembered at the end of halfway through my stay in Yerevan was a story when I was your age in college in Los Angeles, California State College at the time. It was not a university. It wasn't called. It was called Cal State LA. And I think it was my first year. And I had a course in political theory. And a gentleman, much older than ours, was in the same class. After a few weeks, he came to me and he said, do you understand what this course is about? And I said, well, I mean, my education was initially in Armenian and French. So English I was just learning, right? So I thought he was referring to my language skills. I said, well, you know, I still use a dictionary, and he said, no. Do you understand the substance of what political theory is? What does politics have to do with theory? We're reading Plato, we're reading that stuff. He said, could you do me a favor once a week, 1 hour, we get together. You read one paragraph of the assignment. You tell me what goes through your mind. What do you see? So we became good friends. But we were also opponents. He had just come back from Vietnam. He had been one of the first President Kennedy military advisors sent. He had served 2 years in Vietnam. He had come back. And this is the time of the surge, 1965, President Johnson. I was opposed to the war. And I used to go and demonstrate in the streets in Los Angeles. And he was in favor. And we had big arguments. At the end of the semester, he knocked at my door, brought in a six-pack, right? We sat down. David, his name was David. And he said, listen, we've been having this argument for all this time. And I went and checked on you guys, you Armenians and Armenia. You have a sad, sad history. And you may be right. You know more languages, you know more geography than I do. He said, although I'd served in Vietnam for 2 years, if you have a world map now, I'm not sure I can pinpoint where Vietnam is. He said, you know more history, you know more geography, more languages. But he said, there's one thing. We are the greatest power in the world. When you guys, small nations, make mistakes, you pay for it. When big nations, make mistakes, still you pay for it. In any case, you pay for it. And this came to my mind when dealing with mediators and saying, of course David was right. Of course. And a lot of the diplomacy was to deal with big states and tell them, look, don't do that. It will be a problem, right? So small state, you have your own domestic issues, you have your diaspora, you have big powers who think they understand better and they can tell you what to do. Otherwise, thank you very much. This was good.
Thank you so much. It is indeed difficult to learn from history. I'm not quite sure that I would say history repeats itself. I would probably tend to disagree, but I think history, the greatest benefit from history is that it can complicate things. It can complicate things, and that's, I think, point out, get us a feel for the complexity of things, give us a feel for the complexity of Armenian politics, give us a feel for the complexity of Armenian diaspora politics, gives us a feel for complexity of modern Turkey, and I think that's one of the best uses of history. Having said that, thank you so much for your talk. Thank you all for coming. We're adjourned. Hope to see you again sometime at the Wilson Center. Thank you.
Thank you.